Okay, let's dive in. So I want to begin by welcoming you all again to the Untold History of Bicycles. This is going to be half a presentation and half Q&A with an amazing panel. I want to tell you a little bit about myself as well and what V-Cycle is, because this is an event that's put on by V-Cycle. So in 2018, having been a bike mechanic and a bike advocate, an activist, and a whole bunch of things besides that, I ended up founding a business called V-Cycle, which was focused on getting more women and people in the LGBTQI community into cycling, because that was my community, and I felt like I didn't see as many people that looked like me in the bike scene as I was hoping. So my main focus is bike maintenance. We do a lot of kind of one-on-one sessions or small group sessions with the focus of building confidence, competence, and community. So this session is something that came up because of a question that I'd been asking myself, and a question that I realized a lot of people have asked if when they go out they don't see folks that look like them cycling. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what we'll be doing today, we've got a timeline that's kind of the evolution of bicycles, but also how that fits into themes of change and progress and challenges in the United States mostly, but we'll tap into a little bit of kind of bike history outside of the US as well. The big focus is this kind of intersection of racism and then classism, sexism, and ableism in cycling. So we'll touch on all those topics, but you'll see we'll have kind of one theme that connects and brings all of those kind of topics to light. We will not get into some topics that people might have been hoping to discuss. We won't talk much about LGBTQI communities in cycling. We'll talk about racism in cycling, but that'll be focused on the perspectives and experiences that the panelists can speak to. This could be done as many 10-week sessions on each topic, but instead we have about 2 hours to talk about a couple of really big and important pieces of biking and cycling. And finally, I hope this is stuff that you'll all follow up with. I hope that if things don't come up in this session, you'll take the time to keep asking those questions and looking into why, life is the way it is, why the bike scene is the way it is. That's what got me into this, was asking some questions and taking the time to do a deep dig. So this will hopefully give you some tools to, continue to do that kind of dig at home on your own and find out a little bit more of what has made the bike scene what it is today. This session would not be possible alone. As with most things, I thought I had a great idea. I had this idea to come out and teach all about racism, classism, sexism, ableism in cycling. And then I found 5 amazing people that I felt like had way more knowledge than me. And so in a moment, I'm going to step back and I'm going to let them really dive in and lead this. But I want you to get to know all of them because they won't all be speaking at the same time. So Yolanda, if you don't mind beginning, would you do a quick introduction so people can see you and find out what you'll be bringing to the table today?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Sylvie and the team for bringing me on. And I'm excited today to share what I have found to date on African Americans on bikes. I live in Los Angeles, and about 2011, I stepped out as a bicyclist and simply, as Sylvie said, started asking questions. So while riding a bike, I started looking at my environment and also who was on a bike and trying to find out why my community was not set up in a way that was bikeable and safe for bicyclists and pedestrians for that matter. So my background is actually, I'm a mom. I have an 18-year-old and a 23-year-old and a 97-year-old mother that is still living and going strong. And basically, I was an artist in my earlier years. I went to Otis Parsons and was an entrepreneur. And then through the process of bicycling and starting to really just be out in space a lot more as an adult, I turned to a social and environmental activist, went back to graduate school and graduated from Antioch University in Los Angeles in the Urban Sustainability program. And pretty much I've been moving forward since then, just really walking outside my door and looking in my community and looking at things that we can do to improve bicycling, to improve safe routes to school so kids can walk and bike, and also to be involved in what it takes from a policy level to make noise in the community, to make change that is good in the area of what I call mobility justice, and also community sustainability. So I'm just happy to be here today, and I'll be sharing a little history on African Americans and how bicycling came into their lives, or at some point in the intersectionality was introduced in that time.
My name is Talib Abdullahi. I will be one of your panelists today. Happy to answer any questions regarding anything that comes up. I specifically am here because earlier this year I founded and led the first Black History social ride here in Austin, Texas. I'm a lifelong cyclist since I was a little kid, and began racing around the age of 12. Started racing BMX, and then kind of moved into competitive mountain biking, where we were traveling all across the state of Texas. And as a kid, I did not realize that I was primarily the only person of color on my team. You know, it was, for me, cycling was just a pure, just a passion of mine that was just so liberating and so fun that, you don't realize that as a kid. So as an adult and still avid cyclist, I participate in several clubs here in Texas, and realizing that, we just now are starting to have the foundation of some African-American led clubs here in Texas, and that most of these other clubs, haven't really broken the surface of inclusion or anything. So I woke up one morning in mid-June and said, hey, why don't I get a handful of my friends who ride bikes, and we're going to go out, we're going to visit some buildings and some locations across Austin, Texas that have some historical significance to African-American history. It accidentally went viral. We had 400 riders show up. So it was a really powerful, really moving thing. The mission right now is to continue to use our bicycles to help share Black history locally. And we're finding ways to do that across the country. And I know Sylvia said there are many people in San Diego that would like to be involved. So I'm happy to be here chatting with you guys. And I'm happy to lend my opinion and my thoughts here.
Thank you very much, Talib. Hi, everyone. My name is Pranil. I'm from the UK, as you probably can hear. I've been, much like Talib, I've been a lifelong cyclist since I was a young boy. I really, really enjoy it, and it takes up a lot of my time, especially at the weekends and evenings. I find cycling really enjoyable because it's very exhilarating. It's great exercise, great for my health, and it's improved so many areas of my life as well. I'm here because I want to talk a little bit about the racism and inclusivity around cycling that I didn't really think was much of a problem many years ago. And it's only when I've become an adult, become more conscious about cycling in the world, that you start to think that actually maybe people don't look like you so much, and maybe you don't fit into spaces that they do so much either. So that's what I'm here to talk a little bit about. I'm also going to give a bit of a perspective on UK social politics as well, surrounding sport and exercise, because I find that's a really helpful context to just back up some of the points I'd like to make as well. I'll be making a little bit of reference to the 2012 Olympic Games, which happened here in London, which was, I would say, the height of our sport inclusivity. It was a fantastic period in our social cohesion and social fabric in this country. And I'd like to maybe make some comparisons about how things have changed since then.
I'm one of the moderators for today. My name is Erin Mahaffey, and I actually come to this work as a cultural anthropologist who's become quite passionate about cycling and bicycling in my role as director of Global Bike. Global Bike is a US-based nonprofit organization, and we're working in East Africa, partnering with rural women's cooperatives to help them build bike cooperatives that serve rural communities who would otherwise be on foot. So we train women in bike mechanics and the business skills that they need to run a bike, often bike rental program for their community that enables people to access food through their agricultural work, access water, and to grow their incomes through small business work by having affordable transportation. And then the women's groups that we partner with are able to learn business skills, technical skills. They're really challenging gender norms within their communities by becoming bike mechanics. And they're profiting from those businesses and able to invest in family needs and other businesses within the community. So, we're really working on a international scale with these issues, and really delighted to be a part of this conversation today.
I'm Oliver. I'm currently the outreach coordinator for the San Diego County Bicycle Coalition. I've worked as a mechanic and later on as a shop manager. I started at the University of California, Santa Barbara's Associated Students Bike Shop, which is a nonprofit bike shop serving a lot of students. And once I graduated, ended up working at a bunch of different for-profit and nonprofit bike spaces. Outside of that, I've also helped organize the Recovery Ride, which is a local to San Diego fundraising ride. And we raise money for HIV research, as well as donate all of our money to local recovery homes. But in my position as the outreach coordinator, we've been having a lot of discussions really focused on this topic, and I'm excited to see what we can all come up with today.
I want to get you all going with just a super simple question. So who do you see as a bicyclist in mainstream media? When you look at magazines and TV and you see people portrayed as cyclists? Yeah, because to kind of respond to what David was saying, anybody who bikes is officially a bicyclist, a cyclist, but it's not always who we see in cycling. And I took a moment a little while ago to Google cyclist and just see what comes up. And it was pages upon pages of, mostly middle-aged white men in spandex. And as long as that's most people's image of what a cyclist is, then we have a place to be talking about who else a cyclist could be potentially or is that we don't see a whole bunch in that mainstream media. So this is a little outdated as a photo, and I don't think I've seen a bike like this except, maybe at a festival as kind of a show, but this is still mostly the biking population, at least in the United States. So we'll talk about why that is as we get into this session, and we'll also look a little bit at how the design of bicycles and how that evolution has influenced who is a cyclist. I imagine a lot of you have seen something like this. The earliest bike that we call a bicycle was designed in 1817. We kind of move through some of those classic, funny-looking bikes that you might still see again when people go to festivals or, go to costume events when they want to look like an old school cyclist. And then we get into some of these more, safety focused bikes. So beginning with the safety bike, which was about 1890, and then moving into bikes that actually had the option to shift and functional brakes and, matching size wheels to help with how smooth it feels to be on them. And then eventually the e-bike, something that's been, noticed in cycling and felt like a piece of bicycling and not just, a small motorcycle since about 1990. To tie this all in and then pass it off to Yolanda, like I've said, cycling, most people don't think about this, but it's really rooted in racism, classism, sexism, and ableism, as, so much of like the way that we live, right now is. And I think as a bike enthusiast, it's really important to see this and examine it, because that's how we make changes. That's how we make, the cycling world feel more inclusive. And we'll get way more into that in detail. If you have doubts about what that looks like, I think most of those doubts will be quelled as we move through this. So without further ado, Yolanda, take it away.
Before we get started, I also would just like to note that all of the slides that I'm showing have been pulled from a vast resource of research that I've done over the past 9 years. Feel free after our presentation to reach out to me for specific links or specific data that I might share, and I can actually share that link with you. To start our presentation, it would benefit us all to understand and get grounded, I believe, in when Africans became American. Our history and entry onto the lands of America is one that occurred through vast, complications as we would look at it today. It was brutal human trading, captivity, enforced inhumane labor and rape. And as we evolved as African Americans in bicycling. In 1619, basically, is when the first enslaved African arrived in Jamestown. So this really sets the stage for slavery in North America. And on this day in August of 1619, 20 and Angolians were kidnapped by Portuguese and arrived in the British colony of Virginia, and then brought to the English colonists. This effort would go on to become the transatlantic trade. Though the exact totals are really uncertain, the transatlantic slave trade is believed to have forcibly displaced some 12.5 million Africans between the 17th and the 19th century. So as you can see, Black lives have never had the true liberty of mobility justice in outdoor spaces in the United States. As we get rolling, and you can really just get a sense of where were African Americans when the history and the development of bikes was occurring. So in 1793, Congress passed a Fugitive Slave Act, which pretty much made it a federal crime to assist an enslaved person from trying to escape from bondage, let alone bicycling. So between the years of 1831 and 1861, approximately 75,000 slaves escaped to the north using the Underground Railroad. And I really see the Underground Railroad as, back in this time, a form of mobility justice. While maybe not on bikes, it was a form of movement to get from one destination to another. And in this case, African Americans were attempting to slave their lives and to have more humane lives. The Underground Railroad, just like the roads that we work on today in terms of empowering our communities of color, was a network used by enslaved Black Americans to obtain the freedom in the 30 years before the Civil War, which was between 1860 and 1865. And at that same time, which I'm not showing a graph at this particular presentation, but after the escapes were occurring, then we had the Great Migration. And sometimes this is known as the Great Northward Migration. And it was a movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural South that basically were going to destinations like the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. And this occurred between 1916 and 1970. And that's not too long ago. I was born in the 1960s.
So to fit it into this timeline, in Germany, in 1817, a man named Karl von Drais, who was a nobleman, invented what became the bicycle. A kind of little known fact about this is that they'd had, I believe, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia close to the same time. So people didn't have as much access to horses, and they still needed a way to get about, especially people, like noblemen who had expanses of land and wanted to be able to enjoy that space. So he invented this walking machine, which, essentially was like a small mechanical horse, if you will, mostly made of wood, had a saddle on it, and you walk and coast a lot like the kids' bikes that you see today, the ones that come without pedals that teach balance bikes. So this was an invention that was mainly aimed at, people that would have had land and money and a lot of access at the time. And so as you can imagine, moving from this invention to making it something accessible to people, it was most immediately accessible to people within that same kind of social class. So aristocrats, noblemen, folks, in London and in kind of some of Europe that had a lot of money and clout. And as we move ahead, kind of a big jump, just to give you a little bit of context again with who might have had access to bikes in the beginning, buying a bicycle in 1895, you can see in these ads, would have cost $75. But if we look back at what the value of that is in today's money in USD, people would be paying, 2,000 plus to buy a pretty simple bicycle. Now, if we go ahead and look at what people's daily wage was, the average daily wage was about $150 a day. So for someone to be buying a bicycle, they'd be giving up about 20% of that annual income just to spend on something that for many people was only a luxury item. I think something else that often, gets kind of forgotten about as we think of how quickly things have evolved on this planet is that childhood is kind of a new concept. So until about, 1890s, 1910s, people saw kids basically as small adults that had a lot of the same abilities and could be, as capable as doing a lot of what adults could do, just maybe not on the same level. So for a lot of people, childhood didn't exist. You didn't have that, cozy nursery space with a nanny and, education and toys and all the stuff that we kind of give kids now to help them grow into amazing, beautiful, kind of well-balanced adults. Instead, as soon as you could, lift a hand and pick up something, you might have gotten a job someplace to help support the family. And families would have had lots of kids because disease was such a big deal, because cleanliness is also a pretty new concept. So it really wasn't an option for a lot of people to own a bicycle, and it wasn't something that a child would have had. And if you look again on the right side of this, the cost of a child's bike in about 1862 would have also been valued at almost $800. So not a lot of those kids would have been getting bikes as something to to play with. And weekends didn't exist then anyway. So when would you have time to go biking?
Okay, moving right along with our timeline, and thank you for that, Sylvie. Again, working to keep us grounded, around the same time in 1849, Harriet Tubman actually escaped from slavery and became instrumental leader in the Underground Railroad. So again, we can always think of this as a mobility justice movement. In 1851, Sojourner Truth gave her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, in Akron, Ohio. And this really helped her and moved her forward in traveling around the country to advocate and for the abolishment of slavery and also to promote women's rights. In 1863, which was monumental, the Emancipation Proclamation took place, which we're still dealing with trying to eradicate racism. And to think, again, kind of similar to what's happening today, we have a president that has pretty much stand up and advocating and activating against slavery, yet it continued to exist. And in 1865, which again, we can very much relate to, there was the Freedmen's Bureau that was created. And this organization or movement was passed and established by Congress. And the goal was to provide healthcare, education, and technical assistance to the emancipated slaves. And then we move into our actual leaders and voices in this time. Catherine T. Kitty Knox was born in 1874. She was actually born to a free Black father who was a tailor and a white mother who was a mill worker. As a young child, as Sylvie was mentioning, actually Kitty had the opportunity to ride. She grew up in what's a city called Cottage City, which is now Oak Bluffs in Massachusetts. And it was actually known for their mixed community. In 1893, a new bike, again, would have cost about $2,500 in today's dollars and 20 weeks of Kitty's salary as a seamstress. But somehow she managed to scrape that money together, as well as make the time to ride relentlessly. And she joined what's called the Riverside Cycle Club in Boston in 1893, which was one of the first groups of its kind. Also in 1893, Kitty made the news for the first time. The Indianapolis Freedmen, 800 miles away, took note of Kitty's graceful, competitive cycling in Martha's Vineyard. And Kitty at that time was only a teenager, and she placed at the top of all her races, the top 20% of every ride that she ever competed in, and many of which were at least 100 miles long. And so she was faster and more skilled than most men that she rode against. And moving into the, oh, you can stay on that slide actually. And also just noting that she was a card holder for the League of American Wheelmen in 1983 when she joined. However, at her attendance at the annual meeting in 1895, lit fire, and it sparked the newspaper headlines from coast to coast. And at 21, basically, she was advocating against the color bar that was passed in 1894. So Knox has basically gained a lot of attention in other unconventional ways in bicycling, and that of being that she insisted on buying bicycles that were marketed for men only. And in addition, she pedaled around in baggy trousers of her own design instead of the long skirts that women were expected to wear in this time. Kitty made a big difference in terms of being an advocate to advocate against the discriminatory practices of the League of American Wheelsmen. And she died at the early age of 26 with kidney disease, but she did leave behind a legacy of not just a skilled bicyclist and racer, but also as someone who shed light on the obstacles facing African Americans and women. Also, as kind of Sylvie had tapped into, this was an interesting time in the United States as a whole. It was one of the worst economic depressions in the history, and many suffered high unemployment. So Kitty's neighborhood, the average working person earned about $500 per year, which is actually a little bit more. So give or take $400 or $500 a year. In today's salary would be about $14,000 a year. Most of you have heard about Marshall Walter Major Taylor. He was born in 1878, and he was born into poverty and one of 8 children in his family. His father, Gilbert, was the son of a Kentucky slave, and he fought for the Union in the Civil War, and then worked as a coachman for the Southards, which is a well-to-do family in Indiana. And Major Taylor actually became friends with his father's employer, and then they kind of just adopted him as a family member. And through that process, he actually had the opportunity to have a private tutor and eventually to go on and get a bike that the Southards gave Major Taylor when he was around 13 years old. The family actually wanted to take him with them when they moved to Chicago from Indiana, but his mother could not dare part with him, as Major had written in his autobiography. His note was that I was dropped off from a happy life of a millionaire kid and went to that of a common errand boy within a few weeks. Aside from the education, also pretty much moving back home, Major Taylor actually got a job as a delivery boy and rode his bike for many miles barefoot, just delivering papers. He then eventually got a job at what's called the Hay and Willits Bicycle Shop. which paid Marshall to hang out in front of the store and dress up in a military uniform. And then basically, that's how he earned a lot of his money too. But he did so well that he was able to get hired full-time and stop doing the newspaper delivery. And that's when he was able to actually get a better bike. He learned a lot of tricks and did a lot of performing just right in front of the bicycle store and with this military uniform on. And that's actually how he acquired the name Major. And as again, most of you know and maybe don't know, he went on to win some of the world championships. So in 1899, Major Taylor won the World Cycling Championship. And then in 1900, he won the American Sprint Championship. Only 9 years later, the NAACP was formed. Major Taylor really kept himself, he wanted to keep himself in Los Angeles. I mean, not Los Angeles, but in the US, pretty much because he went to church. He was a Baptist churchgoer, but because of the racism, he found himself having to go to Europe and do a lot of the racing. Throughout his career, he was challenged with racial prejudice, and he encountered off and on. And because of overcoming, he really became a pioneer and a role model for a lot of athletes internationally. These are a few examples of the advertising and promotions that were done in this time of 1894 around African Americans and Major Taylor on bikes. So there really has been opposition ongoing from day one since African Americans have gotten on bikes. Major Taylor was really celebrated, particularly in France, and his career was still restricted by racism, and particularly in the southern part of the US, where some local promoters would not permit Taylor to compete against white cyclists. And some restaurants and hotels also refused to serve him. This is another interesting group that, when I say interesting, for the fact that I can't find much information on them other than in written books and documentations. So it really is good that at least we have the few books that have noted the existence of a woman-formed cycling team called Stars of Hope. They were in Philadelphia. And information has been written on them with Andrew Ritchie and J.A. Megnin. And basically the name of the book is Ethnicity, Sport, and Identity, Struggles for Status. And this particular group of women, because cycling actually was really big and growing in Philadelphia, they took up the activity of wanting to join in, noting that there was a rise in bicycling just in other parts of the northeastern US. And Philadelphia actually had a large population of African Americans, and Black men actually dominated the police department, and they had actually a bicycle squad. So basically, they rolled down a lot of these paved streets that were really set up to be able to ride in this particular community. And so this is the book by William Dorsey's Philadelphia and Ours that has a short paragraph or two on the Stars of Hope. Moving along in our timeline, in 1896, Peasley versus Ferguson was pretty much the creation of the Jim Crow Act, which was separate but equal, which meant that this law would bar African Americans from equal access to public facilities. So you can see how that would create a problem with us evolving at probably the rate of our counterparts, white America in particular, and our involvement in any other types of racing and or activities was still very limited. Again, just flowing through that the NAACP was founded, and also just wanting to make a note that in 1916, Marcus Garvey launched what's called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And this really just stood out to me for this particular presentation, because we'll see as we move through that there are locations within the United States that African Americans began to have the racial pride as being an African American and exalting Blackness as strong and beautiful. And then we move into 1897 when Major Taylor actually was the first African American to integrate any sports team within the United States. This was in Boston, where he joined with these men, which is, as I was telling Sylvie, you know, this is a part of history from a standpoint of they decided to be a team. And so while we're talking about Major Taylor today, I think this is definitely an area where we can expand upon our conversation of back in 1897, how did they make this work? How did they uplift in sports and moving forward against probably much opposition? Just noting that Major Taylor was also known as the Black Cyclone because of his championships. And then early in the season in this Bostonian cycling club, the Blue Ribbon Meet, which was on May 19th, 1897, Taylor rode a Comet bicycle, which I'm showing an ad here, to win first place at a 1 mile open professional race. It's noted probably in a lot of information that Jackie Robertson was the first African American to integrate a baseball team, which also falls in the category of a sports team, when in fact Major Taylor in 1897 actually was the first African American to integrate a sports team. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Buffalo Soldiers, and this is really an in-depth story of almost superhuman-like bike riders and individuals. The U.S. Army's 25th Colored Infantry, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The 25th was one of 4 regiments of Black soldiers enacted by Congress in 1866 and led by white officers. Fort Missoula at the time was the home of the 25th Entry, the Black Regiment. According to historians, Black soldiers, like those of the 25th, were often stationed in remote outposts like Missoula, far from the white people who might be afraid of well-trained and armed Black men. They were given experimental, often dodgy equipment and used to test the bicycle because their lives were looked upon as not having value. But also, again, in this flow of conversation that we're having in the 1890s, America was also experiencing a bicycle craze due to the recent invention of the safety bicycle. And this bicycle, as Sylvie showed, with wheels of equal size and chain driven. Bicycles were becoming popular at that time, so General Nelson Miles at the Army headquarters believed that bicycles had potential for being used in the Army, and the U.S. Army approved the creation of the Bicycle Corps. And also noting that this group that we'll be talking about is called Company B of the regiment, and they took part in the War Department test of the bicycle as a means of mobility for troops. Lieutenant James A. Moss, commander of the Bicycle Corps, was the one who led the Buffalo Soldiers. Next slide, please. Also noting that Bob Marley actually created a song, if you YouTube it, on the Buffalo Soldiers. This photo basically is just an example of the load that the Buffalo Soldiers carried with them on every ride that they attended. In the summer of 1896, 8 of them first rode to the Mission Mountains north of Missoula and then to Yellowstone Park. This is a probably rendition, so to speak, of the bike and how it looked that the Buffalo Soldiers rode. Also on this bike were there was tandem spokes, reinforced side forks and crowns, gear cases, luggage carriers, and chains that were covered with rubber casting for protection. Each bicycle also had the top of the line Christie saddle. And this design was a split in the seat, in the middle of the seat. to hopefully make the ride not as painful. But because of the roads that they rode on and the conditions of the road, it was pure determination that they pretty much were able to ride these bikes and stay on these bikes on all their destinies, as well as to carry their bikes through rivers and mudslides and ice-filled glacier situations. A soldier Finley, John Finley, really played a major role in really getting each and every one of the Buffalo Soldiers to their destination. He was the mechanic and also the best rider. He actually worked for a company called Imperial Bicycle before he joined on and was asked to join on with the Buffalo Soldiers. He was basically an invaluable rider and soldier in this particular 2 years. When somebody had a broken down bike, he would fix it. He would stay up all night making the repairs, and accounts described Finley switching bicycles with the rider that needed the repair and told them pretty much to ride on and continue riding, and he would meet up with them before they would leave for the next destination. And basically, Finley rode on both summers of the extensive rides that were done. This is obviously a profound picture. This was during their 1896 excursion from Fort Missoula, Montana to Yellowstone National Park, and the Buffalo Soldiers of the 25th Infantry Bike Corps led by James Moss. James Moss is actually at the top of this picture. And this is taken, a pose that was taken at what's called Minerva Terrace at Mammoth Hot Springs. And actually, believe it or not, 5 of the 20 soldiers were experienced bicyclists. So basically, the remaining 15 soldiers had to learn as they rode. I mean, literally anywhere from 10 to 15 days of practicing before they actually got on the road. They had covered 1,000 miles in 21 days, and having mastered the Rockies, crossed Yellowstone and Little Bighorn rivers, and summoned and the surmounted drifts of hail said to be 8 feet high. It is evident, as I mentioned before, that this feat was the likes of superhuman, for the fact that the bike itself was over 55 pounds. The bike itself, with the gear. So the bike itself was 35 pounds, pure steel. The wheels alone were 6 pounds. And on the Civil War era, tents, poles, change of clothes, toiletry, cooking and eating utensils, spare parts, rifle, ammunition, each man had to carry. This is a map that pretty much, the original map that outlines the last major ride that they did in June of 1897. And 20 soldiers, an army surgeon, a reporter led by Lieutenant James Moss, rode bicycles from Fort Missoula in Montana to St. Louis, Missouri. The 41-day adventure and journey to St. Louis was 1,900 miles. And it took the men through Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Missouri. For the St. Louis trip, Moss picked the path that mostly followed the railroads. And you can see there's a sample, pretty much an image of how the railroads looked at that time. The Northern Pacific to Billings, and then various arms of the Burlington the rest of the way. The roads were so bad that they rode on the train tracks. And Lieutenant James Moss arranged supply points at every 100-mile interval along the 1,900-mile route, considering that the men's capacity to carry on their bikes at least 2 days worth of rations, and that was it. And that was still a lot for them to carry. This is our concluding slide with the Buffalo Soldiers, and it's an example of the conditions and also the order and also the just extreme resilience that the Buffalo Soldiers had. Just a few notes on kind of what was happening in this time. As I've already covered a lot, their eating pretty much routine was they ate crackers and beans and slept on cacti. They also drank poisoned water because the alkaline was high alkali in the water that they were covering at that time. And even through that process of enduring pretty much the conditions that they had to endure, all of them made it to St. Louis. And then 9 months after the 1,900-mile bike ride, they went into war. In April of 1898, in response to the growing anti-Spanish sentiment and the mysterious sinking of the U.S. Marine, these men were called into war in Spain. And they were among the first troops called into action and were vigilant men of the 25th Infantry. What's interesting about Mr. Johnson's history, Isaac R. Johnson, is that he is an inventor. He was an inventor. And if he had not had this patent, we know that it would be most likely that the story would have been told, this could have never happened. So the power of creating patents in this time in 1899, as well as 2020, it really shows the power and also the understanding and the contributions and the involvement of African Americans in bicycling, still facing racism and bondage, and even our U.S. Working to the attempts to eradicate racism. All of this still existing. Isaac R. Johnson was able to create the first patent, African American, of the folding bicycle. The interesting story about Mr. Johnson is that he was born in New York sometime around 1812. And while he was not the first person to invent the bicycle frame, he was the first African American to invent and patent the bicycle frame. And especially a frame which could be folded or taken apart for easy storage. And so this same frame is used today. It's not a folding frame. And it would be interesting in terms of as we still continue to evolve in our storytelling and fact-finding, as is this the frame that actually is used for our current day bicycles that have this particular model and make. Also, a couple other African Americans that created patents were Matthew Cherry, who created actually the improvements of the velocipede, and then also known to have invented the tricycle. And again, this would have been a story that would have gone down in history as this could have never happened, that a Black man is actually the inventor of a tricycle. This happened in 1888. I was able, I was able to find a photograph of Mr. Cherry. However, I have not been able to find any existing photographs of Jerry Certain, who was an African American that designed and patented what's called the parcel carriers that could be attached to several different parts of the bicycle. And today we would call that parcel carriers the panniers. And so a little bit on Matthew Curry, that once these inventions were made, we can't find much more information on them and their lives. And also in all the stories that I've shared, the actual testimonies and verbiage and storytelling does not come from these gentlemen themselves. It is a story that someone is telling about them. So at this point, other than Major Taylor, and maybe, well, there are some that we have a few narratives, but I would say like the Buffalo Soldiers, we do not have any material available to date that I have found that are their personal testimony. So that would be something where we would, for Mr. Cherry and Jerry Certain, to really look into their family members and see if there was any information that was shared by them on this journey of creating and patenting and even how they went through this process of getting this done back in 1888. And also, I'll just backtrack for probably many of these individuals like Major Taylor and Kitty Knox. You know, their families are the ones that had to go back even at their burial sites and get them pretty much buried properly with the dignity and honor that they deserved. So this was probably even more current, like in 2013, that Kitty Knox family actually put her and buried her in a proper location with a headstone.
I'm going to touch a little bit on women and bicycling as well, because this happens kind of at the same time. So following the design of the tricycle, it quickly became the bike that women used. Even though the safety bike was available at this time, they felt like and by they I mean men inventing bicycles and giving people access, felt like this was the woman's bike, given the clothing style, given the ability to easily get on and off and balance. You know, you don't get thrown off a bike like this the way you would with the like 2 different wheel size penny farthings. So this was the first thing available to women. But the safety bike caught up pretty quickly, and it also influenced a big change in clothing style. So looking back at, you know, the Victorian age of clothing, this is a pretty beautiful timeline, but it's also a lot of really inaccessible outfits. If you can imagine these days biking in something like that, you kind of wouldn't. It was impolite to show much ankle. Anything, you know, above basically that shoe line was kind of taboo. So lifting a leg to get on and off a bike was completely unladylike. And so the safety bike, as it was adapted to be something that was more accessible to women, it had a lot of modifications that made it something that women could use, but to keep women in that same kind of style and, you know, place at the home for a lot of white women anyway. So looking at this, I want to just highlight a couple of things. The saddle was one of the changes we saw in the women's specific safety bike. So this really big saddle, they felt like women had a chance to be sexually stimulated by cycling. And so having a saddle that would not allow that was a big deal. You also noticed the brakes installed on this one. So brakes became a piece of bikes in about 1870, 1880, and 1890. They really got popular. So that was a big piece of what allows women to bike, is this added safety component. You have an easy way to stop. It doesn't take as much muscle as you would on the, you know, kind of fixed ear style bikes that existed until this point. You also have this huge swooping top tube. In this case, this actually doesn't have a top tube and down tube, just has this one tube that swoops. Again, this was about being quote unquote ladylike, so not lifting a leg too high and not showing off any skin. And this has nothing to do with the way that women's bodies are shaped. This has nothing to do with flexibility. In a lot of situations, what still comes up at a bike shop is the mechanics will suggest a, you know, women's style bike with a swooping top tube as opposed to what they call a men's style bike with a flat top tube. But having been a mechanic half of my life, a thing I found a lot of, this is completely about people's flexibility. It's not about anatomy. It's not about people's actual, like, you know, physical body shapes. So I've had a lot of men who like this style of bike because they can easily get on and off it without lifting a leg too high. But by distinguishing between male and female styles of bike, it limits who feels like they have a choice in this kind of bike. Yeah, this is often called a step-through frame these days. Last component, in addition to the safety bike, was not only the chain and crank system, which allowed you to coast, but also you have this guard to keep women's, you know, flowy clothing out of that back wheel. So as you look through the ads that came out to help get more women on bikes, because that did become a thing, to not just have it something that was available to men, but make this safety bike available to women, and again, mostly white women. But I want you to take a look at these and just think, you know, who is the audience? What kind of woman is being invited to buy a bicycle? So I also want to connect back to this timeline. So Yolanda talked about the bike boom in the 1890s. 1910s, that's when biking really took off and became more accessible. And if you look at what the cost of a bike was in 1915, it's down to 15 bucks, which today is about $3.50. So all of a sudden, bikes become really accessible cost-wise for many more people than it had been. This is also kind of as an amusing fact, the time when, you know, road building really ramped up. And a lot of that was pushed by the League of Cyclists. So League of American Cyclists had this contingent of, you know, people on bikes that didn't think the automobile was going to be the next big thing. They thought it was bicycling. And so they advocated to get these, you know, quality roads in place for cyclists, not people in motor vehicles. I think that's a pretty useful fact to be able to pass on to people that say they own the roads, because they only exist because of bicycles. So finally, 1920 is the 19th Amendment. So this is women's right to vote. And we'll segue, you know, back into Yolanda's presentation in a second. But I also want to point out that women's right to vote was something really pushed by, you know, white women in the United States. And so even though this amendment was passed, it didn't make voting much more accessible to POC, to Black women. And women's, you know, women's place was slowly shifting at this point, but you can also see in this ad, you know, this idea of the poised, you know, beautiful, elegant woman was still a really big piece of who they wanted to see on bicycles. So in my question a moment ago about, you know, who we think the audience was for those ads, I think this woman is a good example. This is not just someone who's, you know, casually going out and biking, or someone who's going out and biking, you know, 40, 50 miles to get a good like workout in. This is still meant to be a woman who, you know, embodies all of those qualities of femininity while also on a bicycle. So she's pretty limited in who she's able to be, even though the biking is giving women a lot more access at this time. And I think it's important to see how those things happen in tandem, that women do gain a lot more access with bicycles. They can get out of the house, they can go long distances, they can interact in a lot more spaces, but it doesn't happen immediately, and it doesn't have, you know, quite the huge effect that I think we imagine, because it's still so focused in this kind of, you know, sexist atmosphere of the kind of Victorian times.
Okay, thank you, Sylvie. So true. And I know I'm going to try to go through this a little faster because we want to hear our panelists, but this moves into the 1900s, as Sylvie was speaking of, and this is actually a very profound picture from the standpoint that these, number one, it's a posed image. And just a little background on this image of taken in Lincoln, Nebraska, and also just taking note of locations where the information and or documentation is available in African-American lives and bicycling. As opposed to where we're not seeing locations, which, you know, I didn't see, for instance, a lot of information on the West Coast here in California. And I know it was happening, but just in terms of documentation, where. So this photo was taken by African-American photographer John Johnson. And I made a note of recognizing the photographer in this case, because it really is the photographer that made this image happen. And portrayal of where bicycling and kind of how this bicycling tool potentially, you know, fit into these young boys' lives. These are two brothers. Their names are Millard and Delmar Woods. And just a little background that this was actually taken at their childhood home, which is their front porch of 650 South 20th Street. And it is noted that they definitely dressed up and posed for this particular photo. And even though they appear as middle class, at this time, there were no middle class African Americans in this community. And occupations were very restricted, and most jobs were manual labor jobs that did not pay well. And even the photographer, John Johnson, was a janitor at a courthouse. And even though he was an experienced photographer, he was considered more of a freelance photographer because he was unable to get a studio and pretty much do the professional work that he did. And all the families, and in particular, in talking about this family, all the individuals that he photographed, they prepared themselves and posed as they envisioned themselves with dignity and the American dream of liberty and justice for all. This is another photograph that John Johnson took of young Florence Jones and her mother, Kate Wilson. This again was in Lincoln, Nebraska. And there's a little bit more information on Florence's story, because she actually, this is her bike. She did ride her bike throughout town, and where she lived was on the South 7th Street at the edge of the industrial area in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the building that you see behind was called the Griswold C Company elevator at 8th and 9th Street. So to just even give you a sense of positioning within Lincoln, Nebraska. And basically, Ruth Foley, who is a friend of Florence Jones, recalled that Florence bicycled all over Lincoln. And so again, tying into what Sylvie was speaking on, she was a young girl, though, as opposed to even, getting into womanhood. And then she graduated from high school in 1923. Also, you'll note at the bottom of the page, just to kind of tie into the timeline, that at this same time was while the women's rights law and movement, not necessarily law, but movement was happening, the great migration of Black Americans from the rural South was occurring. And so what this is also called during this time is the Black Renaissance. And also other names are the New Negro Movement and the Harlem Renaissance. This is a story that has gotten a lot of coverage, I would say, over the past 5 years. I never even heard about these women before 5 years ago. These are 5 African-American women that's unique in their story. They bicycled from New York to Washington, D.C. It was a 250-mile ride. And the unique thing about their story is that they really did this for an adventure and for their love of the great outdoors. Basically, there's stories being told of them at the Smithsonian, and there's a lot of coverage and more research that's being done on their story in particular. They were 5 New Yorkers, and to call them by name, Mary Lou Jackson, Thelma Jackson, Ethel Miller, Loyola, I believe Nelson, and then Constance White. On the first day of their ride, they biked 110 miles to Philadelphia, and then they spent the evening at the Philadelphia YMCA. And so there was a connection, again, in terms of having the resources and the allies in order to make a trip like this possible, that this definitely was the way bicycling was supported and was able to continue, was because there were built allyships for protection and also to enable them to stay on their journeys if they were doing a ride like this. On the second day, they biked 40 miles to Wilmington, Delaware. And then on the third day, they biked more than 100 miles, arriving in Washington, D.C. around 9 p.m. And this is the evening they took this picture after they had done some sightseeing around the National Mall and Howard University. I selected this picture just to show by 1944 that we are starting to see integration happen with young people. There's roughly about 3 to 4 boys, Black young boys that are in this photo, which really I have not been able to find in much more of my research. So it really shows the role that the YMCA has played across the country, and I do believe that they are really a key connector and ally in finding out and doing more research on their involvement with African Americans on bikes and probably other sports. And just noting on this photo that there's one girl. Howard University also was recognized as using bicycles to teach elementary school students how to calculate the circumference circumference of a circle. And I know there's much to dive into in terms of Howard University and African Americans' connection with bicycling in this, but for this presentation, just noting that this is definitely a story that is waiting to be dug into and evolved more in terms of the role that they played in getting African Americans on bikes. Sticking with our timeline, we're at the 1940s now, and basically, as you can see, the African Americans in the U.S. are, on bikes, but the conditions in many cases are still very dim. And in this photo, in particular, this was in Chicago on the South Side in an area called the Black Belt. And the photographer, like Gordon Parks, this particular photographer's name, he's not African-American, but Edwin Roskamp, he actually also worked for the Farm Security Administration. So he traveled around Chicago in the, basically the spring of 1941 to document life. And so this really does, just in terms of a visual, really does tap into what African Americans were experiencing and the connection of bikes for transportation, but also the living conditions. During this time, also in the 1940s, many African Americans were enlisting for war. They were encouraged by Franklin D. Roosevelt's call for the 4 freedoms, yet the 4 freedoms being freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of want, and freedom for fear, while they themselves lacked the freedoms at home. More than 3 million African Americans would register for the service to go to war. But according to the War Department's policy, enlisted Black and white people were still organized in separate units. And so it really just gives a feel for, again, the climate and the conditions, human conditions, that African Americans were still dealing with. So Black frustrated servicemen were forced to combat racism even as they sought to further the US war aims. And this became known as the double V strategy for 2 victories they sought to win. The 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. And then in 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was killed. As well in 1955, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott began. This is just a visual of when the boycott began on December 1st. And the key thing about this image, which speaks to bicycling and the use of bikes for African Americans in the United States as a form of transportation, to use biking versus buses because of the discrimination, racial discrimination that was occurring at that time, is very powerful. And it really sends a message even to us today. So this really started in December 1st of 1955, and it actually went for 381 days. And one of the key points I just wanted to make on this slide was that Dr. Martin Luther King was instrumental in fighting for the equality of Americans, and transportation was at the heart of his fight, which I don't think we really have, I have not really heard a lot of really that engagement of Martin Luther King playing really an instrumental role in mobility and mobility justice. And I would say that with this boycott, as you can see, African Americans actually did walking, carpooling, hitchhiking, riding horses, and riding bikes, regardless of the weather conditions. Moving into the 60s, again, with our timeline, this photo actually is a demonstrator that is protesting. And so you see how the bike is a kind of the way the bike moves into our lives, as well as how we physically are using it and on it, but also the space that we move into and the space that is around us as we roll on the bike moves all the way into 2020. This particular demonstrator is protesting against the segregationist administration policies at Girard College in Philadelphia, And this photo was taken in 1965. The photographer was John W. Mosley. And again, I'm mentioning the photographer because in many cases, it's not the voice of the bicyclist that we can see their story, but in fact, the photographer. This is a photo I just thought would be, as I told Sylvie, good to show, because when we look at images, sometimes we're just looking at it and we don't know the story behind it. And basically, this photo is a continuation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s effort to advocate for transportation and equality. And so in this case, he was actually commuting as an advocate and activist for bicycling. Basically in the 60s, unicycle basketball, and it really just in the heart of a community of color, really shows how bicycling can be both fun and evolving for African Americans and those around them in terms of encouragement and engagement. And moving closer to the current day, Nelsonville's, many of you might know or might not know, but he is an Olympian, a silver medalist of 1984. And he was the first African American to win the cycling medal in 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Nelson probably like 9 years ago, where I know he himself, a story is fairly similar to Major Taylor from the standpoint of still enduring much racism and also having to really struggle and rise above and sustaining his life and sustaining and feeling good about the accomplishments that he's made, because he's not a white Olympian, he was a Black Olympian. So he, this has been a continued struggle that we really have a lot of work to do and improving upon. Also, he's known as the Cheetah, and he performed in a movie, 1984, a movie called Quicksilver, and that was with Kevin Bacon and Lawrence Fishburne. And yeah, he's still doing a lot of riding and doing a lot of great stuff.
So a component of this workshop is also to look at ableism in cycling. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because my focus is really women and LGBTQI communities. But I think this is a really amazing fact that a lot of people don't know about. So in 1934, the recumbent bike was used to break a world record in cycling on a track. Almost immediately following that, the UCI, which is the Union Cycliste Internationale, which is the kind of governing body of competitive cycling, decided this was not a bicycle. It had to be an upright two-wheeled bicycle to count. And so this kind of led to the end of the evolution of recumbent bicycles, even though some people like heading the UCI pointed out that it was a way more safe and accessible style of bicycle. It was just a lot, it seemed like the right way for bicycling to develop. But this little moment completely kind of threw off the course that would have led to us, ideally using recumbents almost as often and kind of ubiquitously as upright bicycles. So it's a pretty amazing thing to think about, that we had a bicycle which would have been, a much better option for a lot of people, and it just became kind of taboo and unavailable. And so that ties in well to the kind of stigmas with accessibility in cycling and thinking about how different people use bikes to get around, but also what keeps folks from some of those bicycles. So e-biking, as you saw in that timeline in the beginning, is only new as of 1993. It's really only boomed in about 2005 to 2010, and now it's becoming a lot more viable to get an e-bike, but the cost still limits a lot of people, and these stigmas have developed around if e-biking is actually biking. So that comes up a lot, and I've met a bunch of cyclists who would choose e-biking to be able to commute long distances, but they've been competitive cyclists, or they've been someone who's in a bike scene that hasn't kind of recognized e-bikes as actual biking. So a lot of bike clubs don't allow e-biking. It's become much more of a solo style of riding. And then cargo bikes, I think, should just be mentioned because this is also a style of biking that makes cycling way more accessible to a lot of folks, but especially families. And you'll see a lot of kind of three-wheeled cargo bikes as well that allow someone, you know, with problems with balance to be able to use this. But a lot of bike lanes don't effectively accommodate cargo bikes. It's not as easy to move fast on a bicycle like this, and so some of the confidence that people have, you know, riding on an upright two-wheeled bike, knowing how easily you can get out of the way quickly, is taken away with cargo bikes. And then finally, I've seen some really interesting kind of alternative styles of biking as well. So quad bikes for people with, you know, paralyzed folks, people with missing limbs. This can be a really amazing option, but also a really expensive option, and something that has to be customized. And having access to a place to go and use a bike like this is a big challenge. And then blind cycling, blind stokers groups exist in a lot of cities, but this is when you team up someone on a tandem bike with someone who is blind. Stoking is the position in the back of a tandem. Oop, hope I'm not cutting out. Okay. And it allows more people basically to get access to biking. And as all of us know, kind of tuning into this, based on that poll, biking is a really amazing way to boost mental health, physical health. So, you know, we see all these benefits to this activity. The question is just, how do we give more people access? So Yolanda's got a few slides to finish up, but then some of these questions I brought up will come up in the chat with the panelists, and we'll go through some of these topics in detail with a couple of steps and ideas of, you know, how we move past and adapt with some of the challenges that we've been looking at that have led to what cycling is today. Take it away, Yolanda.
Okay, thank you, Sylvie. Yes, this is a couple more slides here, and really this is another very impactful image that was taken in 2016 and flowing with our timeline, recognizing only 8 years before this photo was taken that Barack Obama was selected as our 44th president. This is a monumental move from a standpoint of African Americans, as you've seen in our experience and moving through time in the United States. I picked this photo really to show that this is not 1888 when this photo was taken. This is 2016. This is DeAndre Gafford. He's 18 years old. He's riding over the bricks that were put in over 100 years ago in a historic Freeman's town. As you even heard me talk about the Freeman's Bureau. This is Harris County, Houston, Texas. And to note, just from a standpoint of historically, a wave of migrants entered the city after the war. And the population of Harris County almost doubled between 1860 and 1870, surging from about 9,000 to 17,000. In the same period, the county's Black population increased from approximately 2,000 to 6,500. Most of these new migrants were freed slaves who came from Houston seeking separation from their former owners. So in a way, it connects with fleeing from bondage of enslavement. Again, we were talking, this is further down in history. They were also seeking alternatives to agricultural labor, and also seeking to find out information about their long lost relatives. So just taking note, again, that the community conditions in 2016, as opposed to what we were maybe looking at in the 1800s. So I think in terms of talking about African Americans on bikes today, a lot of these conditions still exist, that disenfranchised communities, lack of basically safe streets. And so you try to introduce a bicycle into these environments along with all the other existing socio-economic issues. And this is what you see. This is what we get. And so I think, what will it take to get more African Americans on bikes? It's obvious that we need to start from ground zero and improving our communities and our disenfranchised communities of color. And just as a note, the Freedmanstown is a nationally registered historical site. And this site was originally a community that was located in the 4th Ward of Houston, Texas, that began in 1865 as a destination for former enslaved people from surrounding plantations. Moving from 1619 to 2020, I believe that the Underground Railroad Bicycle Trail really taps at the intersection of the storytelling that we've done today, and also is a location and an effort to really tie in both the past and bringing us into the future in terms of where do we go from here. So the Underground Railroad is a bicycle route that is actually 2,015 miles, 15.9 miles, which if you think about it, the Buffalo Soldiers, did this ride in 41 days, where people take 3 months or so to do this ride today. Basically, it is a network of routes by which Africans sought freedom during the slavery and during the Civil War. And it was basically created by Adventure Cycling, and it began and was established in 2007. And the locations that this route rolls through are Mobile, Alabama, and ending in Owen Sound, Ontario, Canada. And if in terms of moving forward into today, this picture on the left is actually a young guy by the name of John Shackleforth. He's 25 years old, and he plans to ride 1,114 miles starting in September. Stories have been put out on him in Outdoors magazine and probably a lot of other media right now. So his name is John Shackelford. You probably could Google him and get a lot of information on that. It's actually Outsider magazine. And that leads us into, this is my final slide of, I believe, for the evening or the morning. And this is really tapping into and concluding that our history and centuries past that have carried our bodies and our narratives into the current day on American land. Our ancestors have endured and adapted, accomplishing astounding triumphs and resilience on a bike, but the journey continues. So the image on the right is basically Jamestown, Virginia, that has been made a monumental site now, which is called Hampton Roads in Virginia. Also the site of Fort Monroe National Monument. And so this is where the first slaves that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation were brought. And so today it is a monumental site that basically families come from all over the world to honor their ancestors. And the photo below, which I didn't even know Talib was going to be one of our presenters, I was so encouraged by the work that he did in Austin. And so that really talks about what mobility justice looks like on bikes, and what young people are doing today and moving forward, just as we saw our protesters and our racers from the early 1800s.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. That was an amazing amount of knowledge, and I saw a lot of really excellent feedback come up in the chat. So these two folks will be responding to a couple of questions that you all actually submitted to us in an online survey. So I'm going to step aside and let them dive in.
Thanks again, Sylvie and Yolanda. That was an amazing presentation, historical presentation. And I think many of us would love to hear, from the panelists and Yolanda about, present day experiences and individual experiences, and so we wanted to ask you to share a cycling story, that led to your current day work looking at inclusion and bicycling. So thanks, Talib. You want to start?
I think my story kind of stems a little bit from allyship in a place I wasn't quite expecting it. When I bought one of my mom bought one of my first bikes for me. We lived in a small town outside of Houston, and there was a small bike shop there that was a mom and pop shop. Where the owners were lovely people, and we didn't know them very well at first, but my bike had gotten stolen. And when we went back, they actually offered, us a great deal on a used bike because they felt bad that the new bike we had purchased from them had gotten stolen. And over the years, they really became some of my greatest personal allies in cycling, and they would offer to give me used parts at severely heavily discounted rates, as well as they invited me to join their team. And essentially, since I didn't have enough money to be able to afford normal bicycle repairs, they kind of had me intern with the mechanics so I could figure out how to fix my own bikes. So that essentially that segued into how I began racing mountain bikes in my teens. But without kind of the allyship and those folks who owned a bike shop, continually giving me old used parts and willing to take the time to teach me how to work on bikes, surely because they had a huge passion for cycling, I wouldn't be here today. I would probably not be riding as much, or maybe not at all. So that's that for me is just a story of my own personal introduction to cycling, and what really got me, I guess, to where I am now as a person of color in cycling, because I see many people who look like me, and cycling kind of seems like a foreign activity when it's something that I think everyone should have the ability to enjoy.
Talib, Pranil, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Erin. I've been cycling probably for about 15 years of my life now, over here in the UK. And since I've taken up more road cycling in the past 3 or 4 months, I've really gotten into analysing and researching what goes on behind the scenes of cycling. What are the unwritten narratives that we see all the time out on the road? And that is one of race as well. I'm a person of colour, and when you look at the cycling scene, the cycling population, the cycling media that surrounds sport and exercise and health all around the world, especially in the West, there are really not a lot of people of colour in comparison relative to white male cyclists out on the road. And it's something I want to change. It's something I want to be part of as well. I want to be part of a cycling scene that's inclusive and healthy and supportive. And ultimately, I want to feel like I fit into a space that includes me to take part in a sport that I so dearly love. Where I come from in the UK, a town just outside of London, is, I would say, very much a very white town. My school was very white as well. And I did take part, and I did mingle in my local cycling community, just like Talib did as well. I got to know my local independent bike store. They were fantastic people. But again, as a child, as a young person, it didn't really affect me. It didn't really come to my conscience that I was one of the only people of colour who would participate on the local trails, in the local store. But I didn't feel particularly discriminated against until I became into my early 20s, and I felt, actually, do I fit into this more mainstream, wider space? And that's why I'm primarily here today, to talk a little bit more about that as well.
Thanks for sharing. Yolanda, would you like to share your story?
Definitely. Being a child of the 60s, I always have to kind of scratch my head, because I believe I grew up in an area called West Adams in Los Angeles. It's called West Adams now, but name changes and boundary lines are moved, and we're told later that we live now in West Adams, where at one point it was South LA, because it was west of one of our major corridors, La Cienega. But growing up, I believe the whatever you want to call the community, it's West Adams now, it was like a bubble. And I'll have to just accept that I did live in this particular part of town where I was able, even in the 60s, while if you look at the timeline, we did have a lot of progressive activity happening, advocating for human rights and equal rights of African Americans. I believe I too was benefiting in this bubble kind of environment that I was in. So my sister and I rode bikes as a child up and down our streets, mainly on the sidewalks. And occasionally we would get in the streets, and we would ride to parks, a park in a school campus that elementary school campus that wasn't far from us. So I really was kind of one of those kids, as a book that is written, Last Child in the Woods, where I was able to experience the outdoors in a beautiful way. And I think by having that experience actually has led me into this current day, 5 decades later, of being able to both understand the beauty and the liberty of riding a bike as a child all the way into adulthood, but also in being educated and moving around in my community. I could have either accepted or not accepted that inequities existed in my community and not advocate for change, or I was one that was awakened to be able to say, this is inequality, and this is just as much of a civil right to be able to have our streets set up in a way that we're able to continue safely to ride bikes. And I think it stands out more in this time than it did when I was a child, because of the traffic. So there's so much traffic that's in my neighborhood now. It's not safe for kids or even an adult necessarily to ride on the streets. Whereas in the 60s, we didn't have as much traffic. So that's really what has brought me into this current day. And I would just say that my health and my stamina, my resilience, I definitely connect that to my engagement of being outdoors and being on bikes. And it really, a bike and the activity of bicycling has been my ally.
As everyone sees on screen, I think it's important to ask why representation matters in cycling, and going a little bit beyond that, how can bike organizations as well as big bike companies do more? What are they lacking in terms of representation?
Yeah, I can speak to this one a little bit. I've been following a lot of the work that Aisha McGowan and the folks at the Black Foxes have been doing. And if you haven't heard of them, I highly recommend following them on Instagram or just keeping up with what they're doing, because they're kind of a coalition of cyclists who are more on the kind of the athletic realm of things. Aisha McGowan is the first female professional road cyclist, which is a title I think she officially was crowned with maybe within the past year or two, which is in a way kind of crazy to think about, because people have been riding bikes obviously for hundreds of years, especially Black women. But yeah, the Black Fox's mission really is to really have a very engaging, thorough dialogue with a lot of these cycling brands, companies, as well as organizations that have predominantly been, older white men, all the decision making, who's showing up in these advertisements, where these advertisements are placed, who the dialogue about cycling is being projected at is particularly to a white affluent crowd. So the real notion behind making sure that representation matters is because the outdoors is something that we all should have equal access to, and the idea of going outdoors and riding a bike should be not inclusive to one specific type of person. It should just be an idea that is marketed and engaged to people from all different kinds of backgrounds. And I think that does also extend even to our transit cycling policy planning, and making sure that the voices of some invisible riders, like folks that aren't typically considered bike riders, who might be using a bike for transit to work back and forth, and perhaps they are undocumented individuals or people who can't afford cars, that are not riding out of sheer recreational joy. Making sure that we're representing their voices when we're making policy decisions and deciding where bike lanes and dedicated bike paths are going. So
What are some of the overlooked barriers to entry in cycling? Have you all encountered some of these barriers? How have you overcome them? And this relates to a question posed in our chat forum, which is, is it income that's really the key barrier to cycling? Is it just income that informs the types of racism and sexism, ageism, ableism that has, excluded groups from being able to access cycling?
I would really like to weigh in here on this one. So just to give a very, very brief historical backstory to the racism that surrounds income. In essentially, Black people of color, ethnic minorities in the West would have typically not received or not been offered the most well-paid work, and that would have limited their life choices, their life chances, where they lived, who they socialized with, how they socialized, generally their quality of life, which then spills over into how they spend their leisure time, how they treat their health and their well-being. And this then now relates onto a specific barrier to cycling that spills over today into the 21st century. So yes, the costs of purchasing a bicycle and the equipment to go along with it, the maintenance, is a very, very key thing to consider when purchasing a bicycle, when entering the cycling world. If historically you have not been in the most well-paid work, possibly as a result of your race, that would have been a significant barrier. You wouldn't have been able to purchase the best bicycles, perhaps only second-hand, not in a very good condition, and then that crosses over into a cultural stigma of cycling. If you really enjoy the sport, but you simply don't have the income to facilitate you carrying on in a progressive way, that means that you feel left out. You don't feel like you fit in with the circles of cycling in general. And this can be a really big barrier to people enjoying the sport, people progressing naturally into a space where they're comfortable, that they can fit in with different communities. Cycling has been generally touted as a global, worldwide community where everyone is welcome, but actually that is a thought perpetuated by people who are already welcome, who are already part of the space. And it's very easy for them to say, oh, it's okay, you can just buy a bike and join our group. Well, actually, no, it's not as simple as that. There are many social, economic, cultural barriers that you have to think about as well. And then the cost of repairs and maintenance, confidence to attain the assistance that you require can be a massive barrier to people who feel a stigma, who don't really feel like they have credibility to fit into a space and ask for help, for fear of judgment and mockery. And the last point I want to touch on that list of points is not looking like the other riders. I can definitely say from experience that being a non-white cyclist out on the road, you do feel different. You do feel like you stick out a little bit in circles. And sometimes it goes back to the cultural stigma. Not many people from communities such as my own, a South Asian background, are very much into their cycling and their sports at all. It can be very difficult to actually gain credibility and gain a voice in certain circles of cycling when you feel like you don't fit in. You almost close into yourself.
And I would just like to add on to that, because thank you for that. I think that nailed it. I think the accessibility and education in our communities of color in particular need to grow. I think it is a time of evolving, and this is a good time, better than probably any other time in our history, to really step up and be more genuine in terms of how we actually are included at the table of conversation in terms of bicycling and empowering our community so that we can really, when we talk about equity, really what it should be is something that really focuses more on making just do it in terms of changes. I'm really concerned about how publications like, Bicycling or Outsider have now decided to tell our story as African Americans. We're not a trend. And this is, why weren't our stories told before the pandemic hit, before George Floyd was killed, before all the other African Americans that have been shot and killed throughout our country have been killed. This has been happening for decades. And so I think it really is also up to African Americans in particular, those that are involved in bicycling from a social and or commuting or transportation perspective, to pretty much come together and figure out how we as individuals and as groups collectively can begin to create more neighborhood to communities to city movement and educating on like what we're doing today. I don't think that in particular African Americans are drawn, that don't cycle, or drawn to this conversation. So I think we have to look at those hard questions as to how can we basically listen to what they are saying. And I know part of it is, a huge part of it is safety, that our communities look like what I just showed you is happening in Freedmanstown. Our communities are not equipped. So really we have to go from grassroots all the way to, excuse me, the policy making in our communities. And it's not a small feat, but it is something that we can do. I played a role in getting a crosswalk, a traffic light at my daughter's middle school here in my community as a squeaky wheel, as a parent and a grassroots advocate. So I think a lot more advocacy has to address the barriers in a unfamiliar way, and that we have to be ready to do it.
I think something that's really related to that is the various ways in which we're pivoting right into how communities of color have embraced cycling in the modern day. I think is an important topic to bring up as well.
I have been following this really interesting, I would say it's a club, but it's a group primarily based in New York City, I believe in Harlem, but they travel to Brooklyn and Queens. They travel all over. It's called the Cycle Squad Maniacs, which if you've seen any kind of, media, it's become very popular in a lot of urban cities to ride motorcycles and four-wheelers around on the streets. And kind of an offshoot of that has emerged is a lot of kids as well as older folks in these cities purchasing BMX bikes and giant kind of oversized BMX bikes. So for those of you that work in the cycling industry, you might know a little bit about this, but SC Bikes has full-on supported and begun donating bikes as well as getting custom jerseys, creating custom bikes for these riders. One is named like D Blocks, and I will preface it with like a lot of their videos, they are not necessarily obeying all the traffic laws, but at the same time I would venture to say that I've rarely seen this many people of color on bikes at the same place as consistently as I do when I see what their activity is like. And so they're called the Cycle Squad Maniacs. It's almost kind of like a street crew of BMX cyclists. And for me as a Black person who rides bikes, it's great to see other Black people also riding bikes, definitely pushing the envelope. They're almost like stuntmen on bikes, and kind of opening up the conversation of what it looks like to be a cyclist, because we don't have necessarily this connection of a very urban Black masculine man on a bike as something that is something that we think about, and that's what these groups of people are. And the groups are also very inclusive to people of all races and genders as well. But I know they kind of have chapters of their clubs in California as well, and they actually travel out to California all the time to go ride bikes and have these huge meetups of hundreds of riders. So that's one way that I think communities of color have embraced cycling in a way that we didn't see even like 10 years ago.
I'll just add that I thank you, Talib, for that. I think there's many efforts that are happening and are growing from 2013 when I first started doing intense research. I would Google, clubs in communities of color and really wasn't able to find much. And today, if I Google, there's list and list of activities that are happening around African American and also other communities of color in terms of bicycling activity. But I would just like to note here in Los Angeles, we do have a bike shop. It's a co-op called Ride On Bike Co-op in Leimert Park. And I just think that is an example at the intersection of everything that we're talking about, because it incorporates bicycling, it incorporates the education around bicycling and safety to both deal with the current situations of how our neighborhoods are set up and/or are disenfranchised. So how to ride a bike safely. And also it's a social justice hub. And so basically, Ade Falade, who is my colleague, and we actually both graduated from Antioch. It's also interesting to kind of see how the dots are being connected, like when we're covering our history, kind of what one point led us to the next point, led us to the next point, to really kind of see how we can evolve and uplift this conversation of bicycling so that it's on an even and equity, based playing field. But also LA, it's called LA Co-op Lab. They worked with Ride On Bike Co-op to help them to establish a stronger foundation in sustaining the bike shop. So that really speaks to the economics. And I think so economics also plays a big role in how we can strengthen our communities and have more cycling activities and education. And that also plays a role in making our communities and our city more bikeable. But if we can't figure out a way that we can join in this conversation to make change in our community, I think it's less likely to happen. So the more communities of color that we get on board to have these conversations and to make our communities more bikeable, then that deals with our environmental issues on the planet as well.
I'll also add, a quick bit, but a Major Taylor Cycling Club, which is a Black-led, cycling club that primarily does road rides, very active here in Texas. Our club started, I think, less than a year ago, or about a year ago, with a handful, maybe about 8 different riders. I joined about 6 months ago, and within about a year, we've already gone up to 100 members who have signed up to ride. So, one of the ways, it's almost like we're building community of riders of color who have always been, they've been riding for years, but there wasn't a focal point or a hub for people to really meet and to really talk about, have these conversations. So those riders are out there, and in some cases it's just the organization and the allyship hasn't necessarily been formed or put out there. And once we're able to put that out there, then they'll show up because they are there.
How do you think we can change the perception of cycling, to people who aren't engaged in cycling, so that they will get involved? What's required, more than just changing our language, from cyclist to biker, making the language more accessible? What's really required?
I guess I'll just speak on that. I mean, first off, what's required is listening. As a vice president of a neighborhood council here in West Adams, I'm finding and I'm seeing the power behind setting the platform, kind of as you're doing on this workshop, where you're putting questions out for the neighborhood and, or in this case, attendees. to let us know how they feel and what's going on with them. So it's pretty basic. It's actually not a complicated thing, but it is first hearing in all of our communities where bicycling is not occurring. It usually is some type of fear and or accessibility, but we have to be able to speak their language. We have to be able for them to trust us. And we have to be accountable. We can't just come in and do an article on a community or an individual and then they never see us again. So it really is setting this up for the long haul in terms of making that connection to how cycling will also benefit their community and how the community can become safer. And usually we have to create a map, a navigation map, if you will, in terms of the advocacy work that has to be done, tapping into the schools and the community that in most cases are not having the conversation on the level that we're even having it in these 2 hours, and how that makes the connection to our city council and to our city. And we have to really understand that we play a role in co-creating our community, and to stop thinking that someone on the outside should be responsible for how our community looks and how we should be able to move around and bike around in our community.
You know, where you're headed with that about, city planning and whatnot really speaks to our next question, which is, how can city planning or advocacy work make cycling more inclusive? And I think also what's important is potentially, addressing what's still lacking, right? Like there's been, work done in the past and, currently, but what are some of the issues that we see that are still really needing a lot of work?
Definitely. And I would just say that each of us in, our different circles and different ways that we roll throughout the community, when we come together, our goal is to connect the dots. I'm not sure, with some organizations, they're exclusively just thinking about the work that they do, and they're not thinking outside of the box from the standpoint of how does this connect to the families that live in this part of town and the children in this cases that don't have safe routes to school. So our departments of transportation actually create all this media material on how great it is to bike and walk to school, yet the streets don't coincide with what the plan is. And so really that's wasted money. And so I think, it really is going in and being able to connect with all the organizations that are centered around creating bikeable communities and figure out what's lacking in our community and then create a new plan. I mean, we're in the pandemic now, so, and who knows how long we're going to be in it. So this really is the time to really go back and look at our streets and look at the people in our communities and figure out a plan that's really going to take us to levels that we really never imagined we could be.
Yeah, and I'll think that I think it's on a lot of the work that the city planners really have to enact in terms of making sure that cyclists feel safe and that this access is something that's convenient feeling, even if it is a long ride. They're not concerned about having to be pushed off the road by a car or having to share lanes that they don't feel safe riding in. So I think that is, at least in Texas, where we have very aggressive drivers, something that comes top of mind for almost every single non-cyclist friend that I have is how do you do it without being run off the road? And I think that is something that does fall on both the cities, but also how the perception of cyclists to people who only drive is, and kind of trying to find a line of communicating to the empathy that most people have in their hearts, even if they are drivers, that cyclists are humans too. We deserve to be able to, get around in the way that we choose. And one, building safer, lanes, as well as dedicated cycling paths for cyclists, and, changing the groupthink of people who are only car drivers to be more appreciative of people on bikes, because we are human beings too.
I would definitely agree with that. And I just want to raise one brief point about the experiences here in the UK as well. We're starting to see a lot more inclusive neighbourhoods, a lot more diverse neighbourhoods embrace really good cycle city planning in the UK, especially in suburbs of major cities. And inner cities were always fantastic for cycling here in the UK, but sometimes in your outskirts of cities, there can be a lot of multi-ethnic, multi-diverse communities that have long been forgotten about, purely because they're not your very plush, quaint, white suburbs, suburban neighborhoods that have always had the fantastic facilities. People are really starting to pick up on these forgotten neighborhoods now. And this is what I find is fantastic about living here in the UK, is that cycle lanes and cycle specific spaces are becoming a lot more integrated into small towns now. And this is fantastic that I think maybe the US might take a leaf from the UK book as well.
Thanks, Pernell. And just to add to that, in terms of this discussion of safety, the recent conversation I had with a urban planner on the global bike board was that urban planners, themselves have a particular concept of safety that may not be the same as the communities, they're trying to partner with and serve in creating better bike infrastructure, whether that has to do with cultural ways that people ride the bikes and navigate roadways, or whether that has to do with historically urban planners have partnered with law enforcement. And so this is now being questioned within the urban planning community as they partner and work with communities of color now. But thank you. Our next question, and you all have touched on this, I would love to hear more, is what role do bike collectives versus bike shops play in accessibility of biking? And how can we bridge that gap?
I'll just tap into the story that I've already shared as an example. Ride On Bike Co-op, I do believe that they're instrumental, and I think if we need to develop more of them and figure out a plan of support for individuals that are interested in creating bike collectives. And maybe this is a system where, it's not just one shop, but that we can collectively look at ways that this could spread across the US and learn from each other. I know even with the work that you do, to be able to share that information, we probably could use some of the techniques and ways of assisting people in Africa, literally here, because of the disenfranchisement that exists here, and also the poverty that exists here, and also for our Latino brothers and sisters that, a lot of them are on bikes and commuting, and as a major, as like in Africa, a major form of transportation here in the United States, and they are essential workers. And so that is even more the reason why we need to create bike collectives to both support where there's need, but also that collective can play a role in making sure that our communities are rideable and safe. And so I do know there are organizations like LA Co-op Lab that play a role in helping set up co-ops such as Ride On Bike Co-op. So I would highly recommend, them as a source moving forward.
I think, obviously, from my perspective, growing up under the wing of a small local bike shop that, kind of supported my cycling ambitions. And it wasn't just me, there were other kids my age, I would say, around the age of 12, who were non-white kids, as well as some white kids too. They were very kind and generous to all of us because we were just kind of the locals. So on the bike shop end of things, I think there's this level of just understanding that, obviously to stay afloat, owning a bike shop has historically been financially, it comes with its trials and tribulations. So you've got to work hard to make sure you're keeping your doors open. But at the same time, I think there's a unique opportunity for them to be allies for folks that are, kind of in the middle, like wanting to be avid cyclists, and wanting to level up, maybe more so than what some of the bike collectives can offer in terms of parts and services, and just really working with those individuals and even those cycling clubs to be, more inclusive and say, okay, like we do have some old derailers, we'll give to you, kind of a backdoor deal. I think that's obviously a personal decision, for each bike shop and each mechanic and everything. But I think if those things are discussed and, if it's really understood how much that opens the doors for someone that is wishing to be more active in the cycling community, I think those are monumental. Those are small changes that local bike shops can make that are monumentally helpful towards getting certain people on bikes and really active.
Yeah, if I can chime in as well, I think something that's really important for bike collectives and sort of recognizing their role is, I think what isn't necessarily thought about a lot in the industry as a whole is that, like you were mentioning, making a profit is a huge concern for bike shops, right? And so with every new year, there's always improvements to gear in so many different ways. And often it's very small improvements, like, oh, it's a little bit lighter, right? Maybe not fully understanding from a consumer's perspective or from a community perspective that gear all the way back from the 70s and 80s and 90s is just as good and oftentimes way more durable, right? It's more affordable. And so I think part of that is, the need to make profit, but I think the other part of it is recognizing that co-ops and collectives can do a lot, specifically because they may not be tied to this need to, keep the lights on every month, and rather their goal can be focused on specifically how do I use the bicycle as a political tool rather than, how do I make money while also doing some political work. And I think there's a lot of different collectives. We actually have someone joining us from the Bike Hub in Ventura who, does a lot of work with the large community of, undocumented folks in Ventura and Oxnard, specifically because, the bike has become a way to get around in a much more safe and secure manner, to try and avoid traffic stops, to try and avoid harassment from police enforcement. And so, I think bike collectives, if you can support them, oh my gosh, everyone in this, as a participant right now, please do. So, and I think that sort of ties into, this next question, which is, what does allyship look like in cycling? What are some concrete things that people can do to, quote unquote, fight the good fight on their bike, making things more accessible,
I think that's a pretty extensive question, but I've realized over these years I have kind of a systems way of looking at bicyclists, because I started out as a bicyclist and didn't see anything else. But the fact that I was a Black life out on bicycling, I'm sure the world around me saw me, moving through my space. So I was a representation of what could be for what, as long ago as when I was a child, all the way up into adulthood. So that's ever evolving in terms of seeing a Black life or any life moving on a bicycle is a representation of what could be. And so I think the allyship is that your family and or your friends or your neighborhoods, folks in your neighborhood can see you riding and want to join on. And that's a process of building kind of a camaraderie, if you will, of riders around you. And I think that's an ongoing process. But also what happened to me in terms of building allyship in cycling is I became an activist, and which that wasn't the plan. I was just a bike rider. So I think it really kind of, the question of allyship is an evolving one from the standpoint of what the work you're doing in that moment. And so right now, I feel like I'm more of an ally when it comes to advocacy work. And while I might not be riding as much as I want, I am still an ally of cycling in a very strong way. And in fact, you know, that I don't, there's only so many hours in a day. So I'm choosing right now to do a lot of the work that I'm doing falls kind of in building research, in speaking in neighborhood councils to change community, in giving presentations in my neighborhood where people don't, in some cases, don't cycle, or other groups where cycling is not a part of their conversation. So for me, allyship is really an educational process to get more people on board, and also to get respect at number one, just to even have the conversation. And also moving forward, allyship is that I remember that I'm a bicyclist, and that I have to make sure, you know, that all this advocacy work doesn't dominate me advocating for myself on a bike.
I'm going to give the floor to Yolanda one last time to give us a closing quote to this whole session. But if anybody does want to follow up with questions, getting in touch with the panelists, you can contact me. My company is V-Cycle, and you can email me and I'll help you get in touch with some of these amazing folks. And as a final piece, I've had a couple of links at the bottom of slides, a donate page. So any funding that comes out of this event will be divided between all of the panelists' organizations. And that's vcycle.com/donate.
In closing, I wish to say that while I was surely beset by a number of white riders in my racing days, I have also enjoyed the friendship of countless thousands of white men whom I class as among my closest friends. So with that quote that is all over the internet as one of his famous quotes, Major Taylor's approach to take the high road could not overcome the racism that followed him through every inch of his life. Major Taylor retired back in Worcester in 1910, and he wrote his memoirs, and failing to find a publisher, he had to self-publish. Basically, the title is The Fastest Bicycle Rider in the World in 1928. He flourished, he floundered into obscurity, and he developed financial problems, and he died in 1932. It speaks to basically, where do we go from here? And Major Taylor held his head up high and he moved forward. And really, I think his message is that we have to continue to push forward, knowing that if someone like him can do it in the 1800s, that we still have a lot of work to do, but I believe that we had a lot of role models show to us today, and onward. Thank you.